Are you a bird enthusiast, wildlife lover, or environmental advocate? If so, you're going to love our second episode of Conservation Travel with Roger Smith, focusing again on fearless women fighting for wildlife. Roger has had an inspiring conversation with Karen Dick. Karen is a passionate ornithologist who loves sharing her excitement for birds. She's lived and travelled all over the world, and since moving to Australia in 2012, has become an ecologist, wildlife guide, conservationist, and pelagic bird expert. Karen also champions an inclusive birding community through her involvement with Women Birders Australia and is the president of BirdLife Tasmania. Roger and Karen have shared an insightful and inspiring conversation, so without further ado, let's get into it.
Well, here we go. Karen, you have spent a lot of time in South Africa. Maybe you could tell us a bit about your South African background, and I think there might have been a few other places you've been to too.
Hi, Roger. It's lovely to be here from a not quite so sunny Hobart. But yes, I did spend quite a lot of time in South Africa. I was taken over there by my parents from a very built-up Southampton in England. And we went back and forth a little bit over the years. And then by the time I was 11, we were there permanently. And then I got a scholarship and they said, do you want to go to university in Cape Town? And that was a bit of a no-brainer because if you're going to do zoology, doing it somewhere where the sun shines a lot is really a lot better than doing it in a raincoat in England. So I was inclined to stay. It's a beautiful place. So you start with beauty, and then there are all these other layers to Africa that grab your soul, really. And, you know, back in the 70s, there was wildlife just out and about, just on a basic drive. Every pole that you passed had a black-shouldered kite on it, antelope popping out of the roadside verges. So it was pretty special.
Can I just ask you, Karen, because somewhere through that you gained a deep love of wildlife. It sounds like you already had. This interest in birds, where did that come from?
As a kid in South Africa, my dad had an aviary, and so I got to see a bit of close-up. But that leap to wild birds actually came from a drive up the west coast, and we were driving along and I looked sideways and I could see a bird bouncing up and down in a field. And so we turned around and we came back and we stopped and we watched, and it was a secretary bird and it was killing a snake, or it was fighting a snake. And that, for me, that was my turning point. That was that moment that I think you get when you go, I need to be in this space. I need to be working in this space. And that really honed my understanding of what I wanted to do as a grown-up. And I went to University of Cape Town to study zoology with the intention of working in bird conservation or bird ecology.
When did you actually finish?
1988. My love at that stage was marine birds, and I specialized in marine birds. And my dream was to go to Antarctica and work there. But it was South Africa and it was the 80s. It was too hard. It was still in the too hard basket. They didn't let women overwinter in Antarctica for another 9 years.
Can I ask you, what certificates did you end up with in regards to birds?
Bachelor of Science in Zoology. So old-fashioned, all of these modern courses that you can do these days were not in South Africa at that time. It was really classical, traditional zoology.
One of the things that fascinates me, you're a woman of the world in many different ways. You know, you come from the UK. You've lived in South Africa numerous times. You did your studies in South Africa, and then you've moved to other parts of the world. How many different places in the world have you been to?
Most continents, the US, South America. So I've been to Argentina and Ecuador, various parts of the UK and Ireland. And then I did quite a few stints of work into Europe. So I've been to a dozen countries in Europe, tiny bit of work in Thailand, and quite a lot of work in various bits of Australia, both from an ecological consultancy point of view, but also guiding as a nature tour guide.
I'm just thrilled to bits that, you know, someone of your calibre, with your education and your background, that you then moved to Australia. So What actually brought you here?
I always joke, even now, that I think I love Tasmania more than most Tasmanians. My husband, he had a sabbatical from work and he came home and he said to me, do you want to go to Hobart for a year? And I'm quite adventurous. So I'm like, yeah, we could do that.
Yeah.
But by the time we'd been here, maybe 4 months, I realised that actually it would be a really, really good place to put down roots with a child.
So you're a mum as well as all the other things that you've done,
Yeah.
which is incredible in its own right. Now, I know that a lot of people in the birding community and the wider community know of your efforts in pelagic birding. So can you sort of fill us in a bit on that? Tell us about your love of the pelagics and what you do in Tasmania with them.
So pelagic birding is sea birding. It's the birds that live pretty much all the time out at sea, out past the continental shelf. So the albatrosses, the storm petrels, etc. I think my love of pelagics comes from the being at sea part. That's a long historic job in my family. My father, my grandfathers, etc. My brother was a captain in the Navy and so on. And that salt water definitely runs in my veins. Oh, and when I was young, when we were in South Africa, we rehabbed penguins that were oiled or sick. And so I had that connection to marine birds then. And in the UK, I worked a lot on other species that needed conservation. And I never went near the sea other than just bird watching. And then I came to Tasmania and I discovered that an hour away was a boat that went out to do pelagic birding. And that was the start of a very slippery slope. Because I went once, just after we arrived, with the legendary Rowan Clark. And unfortunately, that was then the start of a very expensive hobby. And I've now been out 160 something times with the same boat, off the same place.
160 times?
Yeah.
Wow. How does Tasmania compare with, say, South Africa?
It's right up there. It'll be a top 5 experience in the world in terms of seabirds that you see. And within Australia, it's right up there because from where we leave, the continental, that's the closest point that the continental shelf reaches the mainland. A lot of pelagic birds will be beyond the continental shelf or at the continental shelf edge, because where the deep water meets the shallower water on the shelf, you get what's called upwelling, which brings up food for them to eat. So we very seldom, you do see big albatross and things from shore sometimes, but that's usually in response to a big weather event that's driving them in. When they're not being driven in, they're quite happy right out there at the shelf. So Tasmania, Eaglehawk Neck has some of the best pelagic birding in the world.
I've never been out with you, but I know people who have. And one of the things they say about you is that you've got the most incredible sea legs. I saw a photograph of you with a cup of tea and binoculars in your hand while the boat was rocking around. How do you do that?
So you know how they say invention's the mother of necessity? In order to make sure I can have a cup of coffee and still see the birds,
you've got to do it.
you just make it work.
I've got to ask you this, Karen. What is your favourite seagoing pelagic bird?
So for most people, the wandering albatross or the royal albatross with a 3-meter wingspan really gets them going. But I suppose part of my contrary nature, of course, I'm on the other end of the spectrum, and my favourite pelagic bird is called a grey-backed storm petrel. And just to give you a bit of a sense of this bird, this is a bird that is the size of the palm of your hand. And the thing I love and that amazes me entirely about them is that bird at that size manages the Tassie weather and the storms that we have and the massive swells that we have, conditions that would kill us. We would never survive. And it just potters about doing its thing. And I have a lot of admiration for things that potter about and do their own thing.
I completely understand that. It's funny how you have your little loves for things that manage to survive. You're the president of BirdLife Tasmania, and you are also an administrator on Women Birders Australia, which is a private Facebook group just for women. First of all, could you just tell us about your work with BirdLife Tasmania?
So I've been on BirdLife Tasmania's committee for nearly 7 years. And then last year I took on the role after the previous convener resigned. And we are a volunteer branch of BirdLife Australia. And within Tasmania, we try and encourage birding. Our sort of internal slogan is, let's make Tasmanians birdier. And that incorporates a lot of different things. Science, obviously, because we can't give advice, or we don't want to give advice that just comes out of thin air. And then we participate in advocacy. There are some really huge environmental issues in Tasmania which involve birds and swift parrots and eagles and a whole range of others.
And BirdLife Australia plays such a major role in that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And look, with Women Birders Australia, I know that you helped start that. Just tell us a little bit about your involvement as an administrator and how you feel it's working with women.
As somebody who's not on the younger end of the spectrum anymore, I have experienced, especially with some of the places I've lived, the disjunct between women who bird and men who bird, and the reactions sometimes to women and women with knowledge or experience. And, going right back to South Africa. And so Janine Duffy decided that it might be a good idea to have a women's birding group, which would be a safe space where women didn't have to worry about what the reaction would be to something they said. She asked me if I would like to be involved.
Can you give us an example of how a woman would deal with, say, a man telling her how to do something and how women deal with each other? What's the difference between the two?
Often men have a confidence that women don't have. And it's hard for a woman to then step up to that level of confidence and be taken seriously. So even those that do step up with that level of confidence are sometimes then ignored or put down, much the same as all those old stories about when a man and a woman take the car to the garage and the mechanics talk to the man. There's quite a lot of that. When I started birding in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s, my best mate and I birded together. And it was quite funny sometimes how that was perceived in a world where there were very few women doing it. So, they didn't quite know how to categorize us and which little box to put us in. Men, in my experience within birding, particularly in the past, but even to an extent now, treat women differently. And some women simply don't have the confidence to be heard or to deal with the fallout that comes back at them. And that was why we made Women Birders a female-only space, or gender neutral, or you have to identify as a woman. So even that, we're not rigid, so that it could be completely safe. And there's nothing to do with birds that is off limits in Women Birders. We only have 2 rules: be nice. And rule 2 is, if you can't be nice, see rule 1.
I just think that last bit, the 2 rules of Women Birders, go back to have a look at rule 1, is great. You are also a guide. You're a wildlife guide. What do you love about guiding?
I'm a natural sharer. My enthusiasm bubbles over, and it's really good if there's somebody to catch that. And that's what guiding does for me. For me, it allows me the privilege of showing people something they weren't expecting, something they have never seen before, sometimes something they are expecting, but fantastic views or a behavior that you see that they've not seen before, sometimes I've not seen before. So that ability to share my love of all things wildlife, it fills up my cup.
You know so much about what you do. And I mean, I know people who've been out on pelagic birding with you, and they're just stunned by your abilities. Very few people in the world can see something from a rocking boat thrashing around in wild weather, a bird that's the size of the palm of your hand, which might be 90 metres away, and say, that's her. And everybody goes, how did you do that? I just want to say thank you so much. It's just a wonderful thing to be able to talk to someone who's travelled the world knows birds back to front and is still deeply involved in it. I'm just thrilled to bits that you and Amanda Lillyman, who we have interviewed recently, are doing something to help women believe in being a part of the birding community. And, you're raising the standards. Women Birders Australia is helping that. And they see you, I would say, as a leading light in this area. So thank you so much for being part of this and for helping us understand the world a little bit better.
Oh, thank you, Roger.
That concludes our inspiring conversation with Karen Dick. We hope you loved hearing about her passion for birds and dedication for conservation in Tasmania and beyond. If you loved this episode, be sure to check out the first in this series, where our host Roger spoke with Amanda Lillyman, a shorebird ecologist and environmental advocate, inspiring her community to take action in the Northern Territory of Australia. And stay tuned, because we will be back in about a month with another episode where Roger speaks with Janine Duffy, the President and CEO of Koala Clancy Foundation, who is fighting to protect the future of Victorian koalas. You can find all of that and more at this link or the Australian Geographic YouTube channel. See you next time.